He had only 3 months left to live, but what a poor girl did next will break your heart. Ethan Gray had lived his entire 25 years, wrapped in the cushion of wealth, the son of a man whose name opened doors across continents. Yet none of that mattered the moment the doctor's lips formed the words that split his world in half. A rare heart condition, irreversible, unstoppable, and cruelly precise. 3 months, maybe less. The sterile scent of the hospital suddenly felt like a prison, and even as his father's lawyers, assistants, and well-wishers spoke in hushed tones around him, Ethan heard nothing but the faint echo of his own heartbeat, fragile and uncertain. He returned to his mansion that evening, a monument of glass and marble that now felt hollow, its chandeliers mocking him with their brilliance. Every tick of the clock felt louder, every breath heavier. Friends called, parties continued, but inside he was fading. He tried to smile when people visited, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was terrified, angry, lost. Nights were the hardest. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how something as simple as a heartbeat could decide the boundary between everything and nothing. One evening, the silence suffocated him more than the diagnosis itself. He grabbed his car keys and drove without knowing where he was going, his thoughts louder than the engine. Rain started to fall, thin at first, then turning into a downpour that blurred the city lights into streaks of sorrow. He didn't care. For once, he wanted the world to feel as chaotic as he did inside. His car engine sputtered, coughed, and finally gave up on a lonely road at the edge of town. He laughed bitterly, resting his forehead on the steering wheel, thinking maybe even machines could sense when someone's time was running out. When he finally stepped out, soaked and shivering, he noticed a faint yellow light across the street, an old cafe, the kind that smelled of memories and warmth. Its sign flickered weakly, but something about it pulled him in. Inside, the air was filled with the aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread, the chatter of a few late customers, and music playing softly from an old radio. Behind the counter stood a girl, maybe his age, wearing a faded apron and a tired smile that still managed to outshine the room. Her name tag read Lila. Her hair was tied messily, her hands slightly trembling as she served a customer, yet her eyes, those gentle brown eyes, carried something Ethan hadn't seen in months. Peace. When she turned and noticed him standing near the door, drenched from head to toe, she didn't hesitate or ask questions. She just grabbed a towel, smiled, and said, "You look like you could use a cup of tea." No one had spoken to him like that in a long time. Not as the billionaire's son, not as a man dying, but as a person. He hesitated, but she guided him to a small corner table near the window where rain tapped softly against the glass. As he wrapped the towel around his shoulders, he watched her move, the quiet grace in her struggle, the way she hummed to herself even when no one was listening. There was something painfully beautiful about her simplicity. When she brought him his tea, their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, the noise in his mind quieted. She asked if he was okay, and he almost laughed at the question, because how could he explain a heart that was slowly breaking from the inside? Instead, he nodded and thanked her. She smiled again, that same effortless warmth, and returned to her work. He watched her help an old man find his wallet, clean the counter, and laugh with a child spilling sugar on the table. Small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary to him. As the rain softened outside, Ethan realized he hadn't thought about dying for the past 10 minutes. He didn't know why, but this little cafe, this poor girl with kind eyes, had done something no doctor, no fortune, and no prayer had managed. She had made him forget his pain, if only for a heartbeat. Sitting there surrounded by strangers and the smell of coffee, Ethan Gray, the billionaire's son with 3 months left, felt something stir inside him, something he thought he'd lost forever, the faint, trembling spark of life. The rain had faded into a misty drizzle when Lila stepped outside to stack the empty chairs near the cafe window, only to find Ethan still sitting there, his gaze lost in the puddles reflecting the streetlights. Something about the stillness in his eyes made her pause. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of silence that carried too many untold stories. She gently placed a steaming mug beside him, the same blend of tea she always made when life felt too heavy. It helps, she said softly, her voice carrying more comfort than the tea's warmth itself. Ethan looked up at her, unsure why a stranger's gesture felt more genuine than the countless sympathies he'd received in marble corridors and glass offices. Lila didn't wait for thanks. She simply sat on the step beside him, unbothered by the cold air, hugging her knees as if the night itself were a friend. He noticed how her clothes were worn, her shoes scuffed, but her eyes, bright, kind, unwavering, made the world around her seem almost golden. She asked where he was headed, and he shrugged, saying nowhere in particular. She smiled faintly and replied, "Then you must be exactly where you're meant to be." For a moment, the heaviness in his chest loosened. She told him about her brother Noah, who was just 16 and dreamed of becoming a pilot. Their parents had died when she was barely a teenager, and since then, the world had taught her to stand alone, yet somehow she'd learned to stand softly. She laughed about how the cafe owner still forgot her payday, how sometimes she skipped dinner so Noah could have lunch money. But she said it all with a brightness that didn't beg for pity, only admiration. Ethan found himself listening more than speaking, drawn to her words like someone who'd been starving for honesty. She told him she loved watching people, not because she was curious, but because everyone who walked into her cafe carried a story, and stories were the only riches she could collect. He asked her why she was so happy despite everything, and she shrugged again, eyes glimmering. "Because sadness doesn't pay the bills," she joked, then added more quietly, "and because there's always something left to smile about, even if it's just the sunrise." Ethan felt an ache in his throat. He hadn't noticed a sunrise in months. They talked for hours, the world outside fading until it was just them, a girl who had nothing but heart and a man who had everything but peace. When she laughed, it wasn't polished or graceful like the people he'd known. It was raw, real, alive. He caught himself smiling too, without forcing it, without remembering that he shouldn't get too close to anyone. The way she talked about simple joys, like rain drying on her skin or the smell of bread before dawn, made him realize how far he'd drifted from life's small miracles. The cafe's clock ticked past midnight, and Lila finally stood, brushing crumbs from her apron. "You should come inside," she said gently. "It's warmer there." He followed her in, not out of politeness, but because her presence felt like gravity. She poured him another cup, humming under her breath, and asked him what he did for a living. He hesitated, then smiled vaguely, saying he worked in business, not daring to reveal the empire that carried his last name. She didn't seem to care. She never asked more. For Lila, everyone deserved the same cup of tea, no matter who they were. When a sleepy Noah peeked out from the back rows, rubbing his eyes, she quickly introduced him to Ethan, proud of her little brother, the way mothers spoke of sons. Ethan waved awkwardly, feeling a strange warmth at the sight of their closeness, something he'd never known with his own father. As the hours passed, he found comfort in the way she spoke of ordinary things, grocery lists, school fees, the price of milk, all things too trivial for his world, yet now they felt precious, real. When he finally stood to leave, the wind had calmed, and the air carried the faint scent of rain and cinnamon. Lila handed him a small napkin with a doodle, a messy sketch of a coffee cup, and the words, "Come back sometime, stranger." He tucked it into his pocket like a fragile secret. Walking back to his car, he realized his steps felt lighter, his chest less heavy. Something within him had shifted, not healed yet, but awakening. That night, as he drove through the quiet streets, the image of her bright eyes lingered in his mind. He didn't understand why, but for the first time since his diagnosis, the thought of tomorrow didn't terrify him. It almost felt like a reason to stay. The next evening came with the soft glow of twilight, and Ethan found himself once again parked outside the little cafe, unsure if he had come for the tea or the warmth of the girl who served it. Lila noticed him immediately, her eyes lighting up with the kind of recognition that made his chest tighten in quiet joy. Over the days that followed, his visits became a rhythm, something his heart clung to, as if the ticking clock inside him could be slowed by her laughter. Every evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, he would take the same seat by the window, watching her move between tables, her hair catching the golden light, her voice blending with the soft hum of the world outside. Sometimes she would sit with him when the cafe grew quiet, and they would watch the sky turn from gold to violet, the stars blinking awake one by one. Lila loved the stars. She said they were the dreams of people who never stopped believing, and Ethan listened, smiling faintly, because her voice made even the simplest words sound like poetry. He began to notice the small details, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the tiny scar on her wrist from a childhood fall, the softness in her tone when she spoke of her brother. He started helping her in ways she never saw. Late at night, when the cafe was empty, he would quietly repair the flickering lights or leave envelopes at the counter to pay off unpaid bills. When Noah needed books for school, Ethan arranged them through a local shop under a false name. Watching her happiness, knowing she would never trace it back to him, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. It wasn't pity that moved him. It was admiration. Her strength, her gentleness, her ability to find light in scarcity began to reshape his view of everything he'd ever valued. One evening, they walked together along the narrow street beside the cafe. The rain had just stopped, and puddles reflected the orange-pink sky. Lila kicked at the water playfully, laughing as droplets splashed around them. Ethan watched her, feeling something bloom quietly inside him, something terrifyingly beautiful. She asked him why he always looked at the horizon when he talked, and he replied softly, "Because it's the only place I still see hope." She didn't press for more. She simply nodded, and that silence between them became sacred. Days melted into weeks, and Ethan began to dread the calendar. Each sunrise felt like a countdown. The doctor's words echoed faintly now, not as a warning, but as a shadow trailing behind his joy. Lila's presence made him forget his illness for moments so pure it almost felt like healing. But at night, when the pain in his chest returned, reality hit harder. He would clutch his heart, not just from the ache of disease, but from the fear of leaving something so pure behind. The mansion he once called home now stood forgotten. His world had shrunk beautifully into this tiny cafe, the girl with bright eyes, and the stories they built between sips of tea. Sometimes she would close early, and they'd sit on the rooftop, watching the city lights shimmer like scattered stars. She told him her dreams, to one day own her own cafe, to buy Noah a small car, to see the sea just once. Ethan listened, memorizing every word, every laugh, every pause, knowing each might be his last. When he laughed with her, it wasn't the practiced charm of a billionaire's son. It was real, unguarded, and alive. He started sketching again, a hobby long abandoned, drawing her silhouette against the sunset, the curve of her smile, the strands of her hair caught in the wind. She teased him for it, but her blush gave away how much it meant. And though he never said it aloud, he loved her, quietly, fiercely, painfully, with the desperation of a man who knew he couldn't stay. Every night when he drove back, he whispered her name into the darkness, afraid that time might erase it before his heart did. The days slipped through his fingers like grains of sand, each one sweeter, shorter, more precious. Sometimes, as they sat watching the sun disappear, Ethan would close his eyes and think, if this is what love feels like, then maybe dying isn't so terrifying after all. But when Lila's laughter echoed across the empty cafe, the thought of goodbye clawed at him. 3 months were turning into memories too quickly, and for the first time, he wished money could buy him something real. Just one more day beside her, one more sunset to see her eyes reflecting the sky. The evening air was crisp, carrying with it the quiet hum of the city as the cafe lights glowed softly against the dusk. Lila was wiping down the last of the tables, humming her usual tune, when she noticed Ethan standing outside, watching the sunset with a faraway look in his eyes. He had been quieter that week, smiling less. His skin pale beneath the dim glow of the street lamp. She was about to call out to him when his body suddenly swayed, his hand clutching his chest. The sound of the teacup slipping from her hand echoed through the silence as she ran toward him, her heart pounding in panic. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him, his breathing shallow, his face drained of color. Rain began to drizzle again, blurring the street as she shook him gently, her tears mixing with the raindrops. People from nearby shops gathered, someone calling for an ambulance. She held his cold hand tightly, whispering, "Stay with me, please, just stay," as if her words could pull him back from the edge. Within minutes, sirens wailed through the night, flashing lights painting the cafe walls red and blue. Lila rode with him in the ambulance, her hands never leaving his. His pulse flickered weakly under her touch, and each second stretched painfully long. She didn't understand what was happening. He had always seemed fine, quiet maybe, but strong. The hospital's sterile lights burned her eyes as they wheeled him through the emergency doors, doctors shouting terms she couldn't comprehend. She waited in the hallway, her clothes soaked, her heart trapped in her throat. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last, until finally, a doctor stepped out, his face solemn, the kind of expression that carried bad news long before words could confirm it. "Are you family?" he asked. Lila hesitated, shaking her head. "I'm a friend." The doctor sighed, glancing at the chart. "He has a rare heart condition. End stage. I'm sorry, but he only has a few weeks left." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, everything around her blurred. The lights, the voices, even the floor beneath her feet. She pressed her palms to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that broke free anyway. Weeks. Just weeks. The man who brought light into her dull days was fading away, and she hadn't known. She stumbled to a chair, her body trembling, her mind replaying every smile, every moment, every heartbeat they'd shared. It all made sense now. The faraway looks, the tiredness, the way he sometimes pressed his hand to his chest when he thought she wasn't watching. He had been hiding it from her, protecting her from the truth, while silently counting down the days. When she was finally allowed to see him, he was lying motionless on the bed, his face pale but peaceful. Machines beeped steadily beside him, keeping time with a heart that was fighting to stay. Lila sat beside him, her tears falling quietly onto his hand as she whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" He didn't answer. He was asleep, his breathing shallow, his chest rising and falling weakly. She stayed there all night, her fingers brushing the strands of hair from his forehead, her mind torn between heartbreak and anger. How could life be so cruel? To give her someone so kind, only to take him away so soon. But beneath the pain, something else began to form. Resolve. She realized that love wasn't about time. It was about what you did with it. She wouldn't let his final days be filled with sorrow or fear. She would give him the world he'd missed, even if it meant breaking her own heart. The next morning, when Ethan woke, his eyes fluttering open in confusion, Lila was still there, smiling through her tears. He tried to speak, but she hushed him softly, pressing his hand. "Don't talk," she whispered. "You've already said enough without words." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding born out of pain and love. Outside, the first rays of dawn painted the sky pink and gold, and Lila knew what she had to do. She wouldn't let his story end in that hospital room. She would rewrite his remaining days with light, laughter, and life. Whatever time he had left, she would make it beautiful, even if it me. Even breaking her heart to pieces just to see him smile again. The morning after the hospital, Lila woke with a quiet determination burning behind her swollen eyes. She had spent the night beside Ethan, listening to the fragile rhythm of his breath, memorizing every rise and fall of his chest, as if she could keep him alive by sheer will. When the doctor allowed him to leave under observation, she insisted he stay with her instead of returning to that cold mansion he called home. At first, Ethan resisted, ashamed of his frailty, but Lila's gentle persistence won. Her small house, tucked between narrow lanes and wildflowers, became his refuge. She transformed it for him, stringing fairy lights along the cracked walls, filling the air with the scent of vanilla candles, and keeping a vase of fresh daisies by his bedside because she said flowers were the earth's way of smiling. Each day became a story of its own. One morning she brought him tea in chipped cups and whispered, "You said you've never seen the sea, right?" His eyes widened, and though he was weak, a boyish spark returned to his face. That afternoon, she borrowed an old car from her neighbor, packed blankets, sandwiches, and a camera, and drove him toward the coast. The wind tangled her hair as the horizon opened before them, endless and blue, the waves roaring like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Ethan stood at the edge, barefoot on the sand, feeling the water touch his toes for the first time. His eyes glistened, not from the salt of the sea, but from the weight of the moment. A childhood wish finally met at the edge of time. Lila watched him quietly, memorizing every line of his smile, knowing each second was a treasure slipping away. That night, back home, she made his favorite meal, or at least tried to. She burned the soup twice, and they both laughed until Ethan coughed, clutching his chest. But and then his laughter didn't stop. It flowed freely, like music breaking through years of silence. She decorated her small living room for his birthday a week later, turning the humble space into a galaxy of twinkling lights. When he stepped in, the glow danced across his face, and his lips parted in disbelief. "Lila, how did you—" She placed a finger on his lips. "You've had enough surprises from the world. Let me give you one from the heart." There was a small cake, unevenly frosted, with a single candle flickering like hope, refusing to die. When he made his wish, he didn't close his eyes. He only looked at her, memorizing the way the fairy lights painted gold halos in her hair. They danced to an old song playing from a dusty radio, her hands guiding him gently, careful not to tire him, their steps slow and imperfect, but full of feeling. Later that night, as the world slept outside, they sat side by side on her porch, the sky spread with stars that seemed to listen. Ethan's breathing had grown shallow again, his fingers cold in hers, and Lila knew the clock was ticking faster now. She rested her head against his shoulder, her voice trembling as she said, "You don't have to be afraid. Even if your heart stops beating, I'll keep your love alive in mine." The words came like a promise carved from her soul, and for a moment, Ethan forgot the pain in his chest, overcome by something deeper, purer. Tears slipped down his cheeks, silent, unstoppable. No one had ever loved him without expecting anything in return. No one had ever made his dying days feel like living. He turned his head slowly, pressing his lips to her forehead, whispering, "You've given me more than time, Lila. You've given me eternity." She squeezed his hand, and though her eyes shimmered, she smiled. The kind of smile that refuses to break, even when the world does. Every sunrise after that became a ritual. She would open the curtains, let the light touch his face, and say, "Another day, another me, Emery." They painted together, planted small flowers outside her window, read stories until he drifted to sleep in her lap. With every heartbeat he had left, she filled his world with laughter, softness, and color. And in those fleeting moments, as the fairy lights glowed gently above them each night, Lila knew she was watching a miracle, not one that saved his life, but one that gave it meaning. The morning broke gently, sunlight spilling through the thin curtains and painting the room in soft gold. Lila stirred awake to the sound of shallow breathing beside her. Ethan was lying still, his face pale but peaceful, his eyes half open as if caught between this world and the next. She smiled faintly, brushing his hair back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good morning, sleepyhead." He looked at her and tried to smile, though his lips trembled with the effort. "It's a beautiful day," he murmured. She nodded, swallowing the ache in her throat. Somehow she knew this day carried a different kind of silence, one that felt final. Ethan reached weakly for his bedside drawer and pulled out an envelope sealed neatly, his name written in delicate handwriting. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers, the warmth already fading. "Open it after," he said softly. She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. For hours they sat together in that small room filled with fairy lights and the scent of daisies, speaking little but saying everything through their silence. Lila hummed a song under her breath, the one he liked, the one that always made him close his eyes and smile. His breathing grew slower, gentler, like the tide pulling away from the shore. Then in a voice so faint, she almost missed it, he whispered, "You gave me more life in 3 months than I had in 25 years. A tear rolled down her cheek, landing softly on his heart, and he smiled at her one last time, his eyes glimmering with gratitude, and then the stillness came. The room fell silent. Lila didn't scream, didn't move. She sat there holding his hand, her fingers tracing the lines of his skin, as if trying to memorize them forever. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of church bells from far away. She stayed with him until the sunlight began to fade, her heart heavy but strangely calm. That night, when she finally opened the letter, her hands trembled. Ethan's handwriting was steady and graceful, each word written with care. "My dearest Lila, if you are reading this, I am finally free from pain. But please, don't cry for me. You gave me more joy than a lifetime of wealth ever could. You taught me how to live before I died, and I want that gift to live on. Everything I own, every penny, every house, every company, now belongs to Ethan's Heart Foundation, in your name. Use it to help children who carry the same pain I once did. Let my heart beat on through theirs." Lila pressed the letter to her chest, her tears falling silently, not out of grief, but out of love so deep it could never fade. Days passed, and the city began to whisper about the billionaire's son who had left everything behind for kindness. Reporters came, officials called, but Lila refused to speak publicly. Her answers were simple. It wasn't charity. It was love. Within months, the foundation began its work. Hospitals received donations, children in fragile wards were given hope, and heart surgeries that were once impossible became possible. Every child's laughter felt like a heartbeat borrowed from Ethan. Lila would visit the foundation's new building every week, a white structure with glass walls that reflected the sky, and in the lobby hung a small plaque that read, "Ethan's Heart, because love never dies." She spent her days working quietly, overseeing treatments, comforting families, and sending letters to the children who survived. Every evening, she would walk to the sea where Ethan once stood, watching the waves crash softly, the wind carrying his name. She spoke to him often, whispering her days to the wind, as if he were listening just beyond the horizon. "You didn't die, Ethan," she said one twilight, her voice trembling but filled with peace. "You just changed your address to my heart." As years passed, the world changed, but Ethan's presence never faded. The foundation grew across countries, helping thousands of children. Doctors often said they could feel something special in that place, an invisible warmth, a kind of peace that filled every room. Lila aged, her hair silvering, but her eyes never lost their light. On the 10th anniversary of Ethan's passing, she stood before a group of children at the hospital, their laughter echoing through the hall. One little boy tugged at her sleeve and asked innocently, "Miss Lila, who is Ethan?" She smiled, looking toward the sunlight streaming through the window. "He's the reason your heart is still beating," she whispered. That night, as the stars filled the sky, She sat on her porch, surrounded by the faint glow of fairy lights, the same ones that once lit their nights together. She closed her eyes and imagined him there, smiling, his voice carried by the wind. In the distance, a child's laughter rang out like a heartbeat, steady and strong. And in that sound, Lila knew the truth she had always believed. Love had not only outlasted death, it had become something eternal, a miracle that would keep the world breathing long after both their hearts were gone.